The story of Lucky Luciano begins not in the gleaming halls of power or the shadowed corridors of crime, but in the narrow, crowded streets of Brooklyn, New York. The city itself seemed alive with the pulse of ambition and desperation, a place where dreams and danger coexisted in every alley, on every stoop, and behind every closed door. Children ran barefoot over cracked sidewalks, their laughter mingling with the sharp clang of trolley cars and the distant wail of sirens. Among them was a boy who would one day become the most feared and celebrated figure in organized crime. He was small, wiry, and quick, a child of immigrant parents struggling to survive in a world that seemed indifferent to their existence. The neighborhood smelled of coal smoke and fresh bread, of sweat and toil, of opportunity and threat, a sensory tapestry that would imprint itself on his psyche for life. From an early age, the boy understood that life in Brooklyn was not fair. Poverty hung heavy over his family, and the streets themselves were teachers of harsh lessons. Rival gangs claimed their territories with fists and knives, and the law was both omnipresent and easily bribed. Yet in the chaos, there was also a strange kind of order, a code that governed who survived and who fell. It was here, amid the tension of ethnic rivalries and the whisper of rumors about shadowy figures who wielded real power, that he began to cultivate his instincts. He learned to watch, to listen, and to anticipate the moves of others before they were made. Even as a child, there was an intelligence in him that sought patterns where others saw only disorder, a mind that craved structure in a world governed by violence and uncertainty. The early experiences of humiliation, scarcity, and exposure to crime shaped him, forging a blend of cunning and resilience that would define his character. He observed the older boys on the corners, the ones who commanded respect through both fear and charisma, and he understood that power was not given, it was taken, maintained, and feared. He learned to negotiate, to charm, and when necessary, to intimidate. His youth was punctuated by small acts of defiance and daring, petty thefts, and confrontations that could have ended tragically but instead became lessons in risk and consequence. Every scrape, every narrow escape, every whispered deal in a dark alley was a brick in the foundation of a mind that would one day navigate the labyrinthine networks of the American underworld with remarkable precision. Brooklyn in the early 1900s was a mosaic of immigrants, Italians, Jews, Irish, and Eastern Europeans, each bringing their traditions, fears, and rivalries. The boy was immersed in a culture of stories about heroes and villains, tales of survival, revenge, and honor that blurred the line between myth and reality. He absorbed these narratives, unconsciously mapping the pathways of influence and power, learning which levers could be pulled to manipulate outcomes. It was a world of contrasts, extreme poverty alongside sudden displays of wealth, loyalty intertwined with treachery, love shadowed by violence. For a child growing up in this environment, the stakes were immediate and personal. The lessons of loyalty and betrayal, of fear and ambition, were not abstract, they were life or death. As adolescence approached, the city's rhythm became more insistent, more demanding. The boy, once invisible, began to notice that he could command attention with a well-timed act of courage or cunning. Others followed him, either out of admiration or fear, and he began to understand the intoxicating power that came from influence. It was a heady revelation, that the world could bend to skill, strategy, and decisiveness. Each encounter in the streets, each challenge overcome, honed his instincts. He became increasingly aware that the system of the street mirrored the larger world he would soon conquer, ruthless, transactional, and dependent on alliances and strategy. In the shadows of Brooklyn, amidst the smell of coal fires and the noise of crowded tenements, the boy began to imagine something larger than mere survival. He envisioned a path that could elevate him above the chaos, a way to transform instinct and intellect into authority. The seeds of ambition were planted quietly, nurtured by necessity, opportunity, and observation. He would not merely be a participant in the underworld, he would reshape it. The whispers of his potential began long before the headlines, long before the arrests and trials, long before the myth of Lucky Luciano would eclipse the man himself. In those early days, he was both a product of his environment and a young architect of destiny, poised on the edge of a future that would rewrite the rules of crime and power in America forever. Brooklyn in the early 20th century was a city of contrasts, where hope and desperation collided on every corner. Immigrants poured in from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe, seeking better lives, yet too often finding only crowded tenements, unrelenting labor, and streets ruled by gangs. For the young lucky Luciano, the neighborhood was both a playground and a battlefield. The narrow streets were filled with the clatter of horse-drawn carts, the shouts of vendors, and the cries of children chasing marbles or pigeons, while just around the corner, rival boys brandished knives and pipes as if conducting business as seriously as any boardroom. It was a world in which survival demanded awareness, courage, and the ability to read people's intentions before they even acted. Luciano absorbed this world like a sponge, taking note of patterns in human behavior, the way fear could control men, and how loyalty could be both weapon and weakness. His family struggled to make ends meet, his father working long hours and his mother keeping the household together under constant strain. Poverty was a relentless teacher, instilling both caution and cunning. Luciano watched adults navigate this environment with strategies that were sometimes moral, sometimes morally ambiguous. He learned early that rules were flexible for those clever enough to bend them and that power, however small, could change the trajectory of one's life. The lessons of scarcity and resourcefulness became the foundation of a mind that would later master not just the streets but an entire criminal empire. The tenements themselves were microcosms of society, a place where rivalries could ignite over the smallest insult, and where alliances, once formed, could last a lifetime or end in sudden violence. This environment instilled in him an acute sense of timing and risk, the understanding that one misstep could cost everything, yet one bold move could catapult a man into prominence. Education for Luciano was sporadic. The classroom could not hold him, he was too restless, too observant, and the lessons of the street were far more compelling. He spent hours wandering the neighborhood, absorbing conversations, watching the interactions of older boys and men who commanded respect with both fear and charm. He was fascinated by their ability to negotiate, intimidate, and strategize. Each street corner became a lesson in human psychology. The way a man carried himself, the flicker of hesitation in his eyes, or the subtle tone in his voice could indicate loyalty or betrayal. Luciano learned to exploit these signals, shaping his behavior to manipulate outcomes to his advantage. He became adept at projecting confidence beyond his years, convincing even older boys to follow his lead or hesitate just long enough for him to gain the upper hand. This skill, honed in Brooklyn's alleys, would later allow him to navigate the treacherous waters of organized crime with unprecedented acumen. Brooklyn's immigrant culture also deeply influenced Luciano's understanding of hierarchy and loyalty. Italian families, clinging to traditions of honor and obedience, imparted values that were both protective and restrictive. The streets demanded their own code, one that often collided with familial expectations. Luciano absorbed both worlds, understanding that survival required mastering dual identities, the dutiful son, and the ambitious, calculating young man willing to take risks that others would avoid. In this environment, he began to grasp the dynamics of power. Fear could enforce loyalty where love might fail, and respect could be bought as easily as it could be earned through brutality. The interplay of these forces fascinated him, shaping a philosophy that would later become central to his leadership style. Early encounters with the local gangs taught him more than any classroom ever could. He witnessed acts of violence, betrayal, and courage that left lasting impressions. Some fights were over territory, others over money, and still others over slights that seemed insignificant to outsiders. Luciano observed the consequences of misjudgment, the cost of trusting the wrong person, the danger of hesitation, and the rewards of decisive action. He learned to anticipate moves before they happened, to manipulate situations to his advantage, and to identify potential allies and threats with uncanny precision. Even in adolescence, there was a sense of inevitability in his movements. He seemed to glide through conflicts, avoiding disaster while extracting advantage, a skill that would define his rise to power. Brooklyn was also a theater of stories. Older men recounted legends of immigrants who had made their fortunes through cunning or ruthlessness, of gangs who ruled neighborhoods with a mixture of fear and charisma. These tales, half myth and half history, fascinated Luciano. He internalized the moral and psychological lessons embedded in them, recognizing that survival and dominance required a combination of intellect, timing, and audacity. He began to envision a life beyond petty street conflicts, a future in which his skills could be scaled, applied to a broader world where influence and wealth were the ultimate measures of success. By the time he reached his late teens, Luciano had emerged from Brooklyn not merely as a streetwise youth but as a figure of quiet authority among his peers. He commanded respect, not through physical size alone, but through strategic thinking, charisma, and an instinct for reading human behavior. He was beginning to understand the structures of power that governed even the most chaotic environments, a prelude to the empire he would one day build. The streets of Brooklyn had shaped him, tested him, and hardened him, preparing him for a life in which intelligence, timing, and psychological acuity would become as deadly as any weapon. As Luciano moved from childhood into adolescence, the streets of Brooklyn became both his playground and his proving ground. The games of marbles and hopscotch were replaced by tests of courage, loyalty, and cunning, where a slip could mean humiliation, or worse. It was a world ruled by the unwritten law of survival, strength tempered by intelligence, aggression softened by strategy. Early on, he discovered the intoxicating sense of control that came from commanding attention, guiding outcomes, and bending others to his will without firing a shot. The smaller gangs of the neighborhood became laboratories for experimentation. He observed who was brave, who was weak, who could be persuaded and who would strike without hesitation, and he began to catalog these traits, memorizing patterns of behavior that would later help him orchestrate alliances and manipulate rivals on a much larger scale. In these formative years, the allure of power became impossible to ignore. Streets teeming with violence taught him lessons that no teacher could provide. He saw older boys wield authority not through intellect alone but through intimidation, reputation, and precise acts of calculated aggression. He saw how fear could be as potent as friendship, how the perception of strength often mattered more than strength itself. Every corner held a lesson, a fight over a patch of sidewalk, a dispute about stolen goods, a sudden act of revenge that spiraled into chaos. He internalized the rhythms of conflict, learning to anticipate the movements of both allies and enemies. By understanding human impulses, he began to manipulate the environment to his advantage, asserting influence without necessarily resorting to violence. Even then, his reputation for quick thinking and audacity began to precede him. Luciano's initiation into organized crime began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A stolen wallet here, a minor burglary there, each act tested his ability to weigh risk and reward. Unlike other youths, he was not satisfied with random theft or aimless mischief. He began to see patterns, markets of opportunity, and the hierarchies that governed the underworld. Petty crimes were the first stepping stones, but he approached them methodically, calculating their impact and ensuring that each action enhanced his standing among peers and potential allies. These early experiences were more than survival exercises, they were lessons in human psychology, negotiation, and strategy. They taught him that influence could often be gained through subtle manipulation, the careful timing of threats, or the display of selective generosity. Rivalries in Brooklyn were fierce and constant, and Luciano learned quickly that survival depended on more than raw courage. Loyalty was a currency, betrayal a constant threat. He began to forge alliances with boys who had influence, choosing friends not merely for companionship but for strategic advantage. These relationships were governed by implicit contracts, support in exchange for protection, information in exchange for loyalty. He became adept at reading the intentions behind words and gestures, understanding that what was unsaid often mattered more than what was spoken. In the crucible of these street conflicts, he developed a psychological acumen that would later allow him to orchestrate vast networks of crime, where loyalty and betrayal could coexist in a delicate, almost invisible balance. Violence, though inevitable, was not random in Luciano's world. He learned to wield it selectively, with precision, understanding its psychological as well as physical impact. A well-timed act of aggression could elevate him above rivals, secure allegiance, and instill fear simultaneously. He studied the consequences of every action, measuring the potential backlash, and calculating which moves would cement his reputation. Even minor confrontations became exercises in strategy, who to confront, who to avoid, and how to project power in ways that amplified influence without attracting unnecessary danger. In this, he differed from many of his contemporaries. Where others acted on impulse, he observed, reflected, and executed with a foresight that belied his age. Brooklyn's multicultural environment also played a critical role in shaping him. The neighborhood was a mosaic of Italian, Jewish, and Irish communities, each with its own networks, loyalties, and codes of behavior. Luciano learned to navigate these overlapping spheres, understanding the subtleties of negotiation, cultural expectation, and power projection. He observed the older men who controlled local businesses and illicit trades, noting how influence extended beyond brute force into areas of persuasion, extortion, and subtle coercion. It was in this milieu that Luciano began to conceive of crime not merely as survival but as enterprise, a system that could be organized, optimized, and expanded beyond the narrow confines of his neighborhood. By the time he approached adulthood, Luciano had earned a reputation as a young man who combined intellect, charisma, and calculated aggression. Stories of his audacity circulated among both peers and older criminals, enhancing his mystique and attracting both allies and enemies. He was no longer merely a participant in the street gangs of Brooklyn, he was emerging as a strategist, a manipulator, and a leader. The lessons of fear, loyalty, and psychological control were deeply embedded, forming the blueprint of a criminal mind that would later reshape organized crime in America. Each experience, each fight, theft, or alliance, was a calculated step toward power, an apprenticeship in the art of influence and dominance. The foundations of his future empire were being laid, brick by brick, in the narrow, crowded streets that had tested and shaped him. Even at this young age, there was an unmistakable duality in him, a charm that could win loyalty, and a ruthlessness that could destroy rivals. He understood the intoxicating thrill of risk, the allure of control, and the subtle satisfaction of seeing others bend to his will without realizing it. These early experiences would define not only his methods but his philosophy, that power is not seized in chaos, but orchestrated through observation, calculation, and psychological mastery. Brooklyn had made him clever, resilient, and ambitious, preparing him to rise beyond the neighborhood, beyond the petty rivalries, and into a world where his mind would become his most dangerous weapon. As Luciano moved from adolescence into young adulthood, Brooklyn's streets were no longer a playground, they had become a proving ground for ambition, cunning, and survival. The city teemed with rival gangs, each with its own code, its own hierarchy, and its own methods of enforcing power. Violence was never far away, and loyalty was a fragile commodity. In this environment, Luciano's sharp mind and instinct for strategy began to set him apart. He understood that brute strength alone was insufficient, influence, reputation, and alliances were far more potent tools. He began cultivating relationships with older figures who held real authority in the neighborhood's underworld, men whose names inspired both respect and fear. He learned to navigate these networks with the precision of a chess player, understanding that every move, every conversation, every glance could tip the balance of power in his favor. Brooklyn's criminal landscape at the time was fragmented and chaotic. Gangs fought over territory, protection rackets, and illegal trades, often erupting into bloodshed with little warning. Law enforcement was inconsistent, often corrupt, and frequently powerless against the deeply entrenched networks of influence. Luciano observed all of this with a keen eye, recognizing patterns of conflict, loyalty, and betrayal. He saw the destructive inefficiency of the disorganized factions and began imagining a world where such chaos could be harnessed, where disputes could be mediated, power could be centralized, and profits could be maximized. It was an audacious vision, especially for a young man barely out of his teens, but his experiences on the streets had taught him to act boldly, to calculate risk, and to exploit opportunity where others saw only danger. His rise through the ranks was methodical. Unlike many who relied on impulsive violence, Luciano combined strategic action with psychological insight. He built alliances carefully, choosing partners whose influence could be leveraged and whose weaknesses could be managed. At the same time, he identified rivals whose ambition threatened him, studying their behavior and anticipating their moves. He became a master of manipulation, using charm, intimidation, and strategic generosity to bend outcomes to his favor. A well-timed act of loyalty could secure an ally's obedience, while a calculated threat could neutralize a potential adversary without ever needing to draw blood. These early lessons in power dynamics were as critical as any fight he had won, and they foreshadowed the sophisticated strategies he would employ in his later empire. Brooklyn's underworld was also deeply entwined with the immigrant experience, and Luciano understood the nuances of ethnic politics. Italian neighborhoods were tightly knit, bound by familial loyalty and the traditions of the old country, but they were also rife with rivalries and vendettas. Luciano learned to navigate these delicate waters, using cultural understanding as a tool of influence. He realized that power could be wielded not just through violence but through persuasion, respect, and fear in precise measure. He studied the older generation of Italian gangsters and Jewish mob figures, observing how they negotiated, brokered alliances, and expanded their influence. These observations would inform his revolutionary approach to organized crime, a system that combined structure, discipline, and psychological acuity to dominate the underworld. It was during this period that Luciano began to understand the value of networks, both formal and informal. Every connection, whether a street-level thug, a union official, or a small-time racketeer, was a potential asset if properly managed. He learned to deploy influence like currency, trading favors, loyalty, and protection to consolidate his position. He understood that reputation was the cornerstone of power. A well-timed act of decisiveness could elevate him above peers, while a failure to act could lead to humiliation or worse. His ability to perceive and manipulate social hierarchies became a defining feature of his rise, allowing him to navigate rivalries that might have destroyed others. In the chaotic, violent environment of Brooklyn, Luciano's mind was as lethal as any weapon. The psychological games he played extended beyond alliances and rivalries to the art of perception itself. He learned to present himself as fearless, confident, and always in control, even when navigating treacherous situations. He understood that intimidation and respect often mattered more than physical dominance. A whispered rumor, a strategically leaked threat, or a carefully timed show of strength could accomplish more than brute force alone. By mastering the psychology of those around him, he was able to manipulate rivals, secure allies, and maintain an aura of invincibility that would later become legendary. Even at a young age, Luciano understood that appearances could shape reality, and he wielded perception with calculated precision. Luciano's ascent was also marked by calculated risk-taking. He was willing to engage in confrontations that others would avoid, but only after careful assessment of the potential consequences. He learned to balance aggression with foresight, striking decisively when the moment was right and retreating when prudence dictated. This combination of courage, intellect, and timing distinguished him from his contemporaries, allowing him to climb the ranks while minimizing exposure to unnecessary danger. Violence, when used, was not random, it was strategic, a tool for shaping the environment, establishing dominance, and reinforcing his growing reputation. His enemies began to regard him with a mixture of fear and respect, while potential allies recognized his vision and intellect as rare assets in a brutal world. By the time he was fully immersed in the criminal landscape, Luciano had become a figure of emerging authority. He was no longer a mere participant in the street wars of Brooklyn, he was a strategist, a manipulator, and an architect of influence. His relationships with allies and rivals alike were guided by a calculated understanding of human behavior, and his capacity to anticipate moves before they occurred set him apart. Every alliance, every confrontation, every act of intimidation or charm was a step in the careful construction of a network that would eventually span beyond Brooklyn itself. The chaotic streets of his youth had become a proving ground for the methods, strategies, and psychological mastery that would define the modern mafia. Even as he expanded his influence, Luciano maintained a keen sense of observation and adaptability. He understood that power was never static and that threats could emerge from unexpected quarters. He constantly refined his approach, balancing risk and reward, fear and loyalty, aggression and diplomacy. The environment that had shaped him, a world of poverty, ethnic rivalry, and violent ambition, had honed his instincts, sharpened his intellect, and forged a relentless drive for control. By the time he began to formally establish his presence in the wider criminal world, Luciano had already absorbed the lessons that would make him one of the most innovative, feared, and respected figures in American organized crime history. His genius lay not only in his audacity but in his meticulous understanding of people, power, and the psychology of influence, skills that would allow him to reshape the underworld forever. By the late 1920s, Lucky Luciano had outgrown the narrow confines of Brooklyn streets. The petty rivalries, the local gang skirmishes, and the sporadic acts of violence that had once defined his world were no longer enough to satisfy his ambition. He had seen the destructive inefficiency of the disorganized factions around him and recognized that the mafia, as it existed, was fractured, unstable, and vulnerable to both internal betrayal and external enforcement. The old ways, rule by brute force, personal vendettas, and family loyalty, were antiquated, insufficient for the scale of influence and profit he envisioned. What was needed, Luciano realized, was a revolution, a transformation of chaos into order, of violence into structured enterprise, of fear into loyalty through psychological and organizational mastery. He began to conceive of a system that could endure beyond the whims of men and rivalries, a blueprint for a modern criminal empire that would command respect, fear, and obedience in equal measure. The genius of Luciano lay in his understanding of both human nature and organizational psychology. He observed that the mafia's strength had always been rooted in loyalty, secrecy, and the perception of invincibility, yet its vulnerabilities were equally apparent. Families operated independently, rivalries erupted unpredictably, and internecine violence weakened their collective power. Luciano envisioned a structure that retained the essential elements of control, loyalty enforced by fear, secrecy maintained by ritual and oath, but combined them with a rational hierarchy, clear communication, and strategic alliances. He began to cultivate relationships not only with powerful figures within Italian-American crime but also with Jewish, Irish, and other groups who controlled valuable operations in gambling, bootlegging, and labor rackets. He understood that power was not absolute, it was relational, built on networks of influence that could be leveraged, expanded, and protected. Central to Luciano's reorganization was the creation of the Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes, regulate territories, and establish order among the previously warring families. This was unprecedented. For centuries, crime families had operated like isolated kingdoms, each answering only to its own hierarchy and its own code. Luciano's vision was broader, a council that could enforce rules, adjudicate conflicts, and prevent unnecessary bloodshed that weakened collective power. He understood that violence, while essential as a tool of control, could not be allowed to spiral unchecked. By institutionalizing authority and establishing a governing framework, Luciano ensured that disputes would be managed strategically, rather than impulsively. It was a radical application of corporate principles to the underworld, blending intimidation with regulation, tradition with innovation. Luciano's approach was also deeply psychological. He understood that human loyalty was a currency, fragile and easily corrupted if not managed properly. He cultivated respect and obedience not through constant threat alone but through carefully calibrated demonstrations of power, strategic rewards, and selective acts of kindness or indulgence for those who proved their usefulness. Conversely, betrayal or incompetence was met with swift and unmistakable retribution, reinforcing the perception that Luciano's authority was both absolute and inevitable. He was a master of timing, knowing precisely when to intimidate, when to reward, and when to manipulate perception to maintain an aura of invincibility. Even the most ambitious rivals learned that crossing him carried consequences beyond immediate retaliation. It was a challenge to an entire system he had carefully constructed. Luciano also revolutionized the operational side of organized crime. Whereas previous generations had treated crime as a series of disconnected acts, bootlegging here, gambling there, extortion on the side, Luciano began to view the underworld as an integrated enterprise. He applied methods of coordination, strategic planning, and risk management that mirrored legitimate business practices. Operations were divided into territories and specialties, overseen by trusted lieutenants who reported directly to him. This not only maximized efficiency but also created layers of protection. Luciano could exercise control while maintaining plausible deniability, insulating himself from law enforcement and rival attacks. The mafia, under his guidance, became less a collection of violent factions and more a disciplined network, capable of coordinating large-scale operations and enforcing compliance across ethnic and geographic boundaries. Key to this transformation was his ability to forge alliances with unconventional partners. Luciano recognized the value of pragmatic collaboration, aligning with Jewish and Irish criminals who controlled lucrative operations that could be mutually beneficial. He bridged divides that previous generations had allowed to fester, demonstrating that loyalty to vision and profit could outweigh ethnic or familial rivalries. This inclusivity, however, was not altruistic, it was strategic. By cultivating diverse alliances, Luciano reduced threats, increased operational capacity, and ensured that any attempt to challenge his authority would have to contend with a broad coalition of interests. In doing so, he elevated himself from a Brooklyn gangster to a national figure capable of influencing the entire criminal ecosystem of the United States. The psychological and organizational sophistication of Luciano's methods also extended to his handling of rivals. Rather than relying solely on violence, he preferred negotiation, leverage, and strategic pressure to neutralize threats. When bloodshed was necessary, it was precise and symbolic, sending messages that reinforced hierarchy and loyalty without creating unmanageable chaos. He recognized the power of perception. A well-placed act of retribution or intimidation could achieve more than endless conflict, ensuring compliance while conserving resources and minimizing exposure to law enforcement. In this way, Luciano was not merely building an empire of crime, he was engineering a culture, a system in which fear, respect, and loyalty were carefully calibrated to maintain long-term stability and dominance. As he consolidated power, Luciano's vision extended beyond immediate gains. He sought to create a legacy, a system resilient enough to survive beyond his personal involvement. The mafia, under his guidance, became a structured, interdependent network where individual families retained autonomy but operated under agreed rules and shared objectives. This system reduced the destructive rivalries that had plagued previous generations, channeling competition into controlled, profitable enterprise. Luciano's ability to blend organizational efficiency with psychological control was unprecedented, and it transformed the underworld from a chaotic collection of factions into a cohesive, disciplined, and highly profitable system. By the end of this period, Luciano had emerged not just as a powerful mobster but as a visionary architect of modern organized crime. His ability to see the larger picture, to manipulate human behavior, and to integrate strategy, structure, and psychology into a coherent system set him apart from every predecessor. He had not only reorganized the mafia, he had elevated it, creating a framework that would endure for decades and influence criminal operations worldwide. The streets that had once been a proving ground for a streetwise kid had become the foundation for an empire, and Luciano, now recognized as both a strategist and a leader, was poised to expand his influence far beyond Brooklyn. His genius lay not just in ambition or ruthlessness, but in his capacity to envision an entire system, to organize chaos, and to command loyalty with a precision that few could ever match. Once Luciano had built the framework of a modern mafia, he turned his attention to the engine that would power it, business. Unlike earlier generations of criminals who treated crime as a series of disconnected opportunities, Luciano approached it as a network of interdependent enterprises, each feeding the other and maximizing profit. Gambling, bootlegging, and union rackets were no longer isolated ventures, they were components of a sophisticated machine orchestrated with precision. He understood that money was the lifeblood of power, and control over revenue streams translated directly into influence, leverage, and longevity. Every operation was assessed not only for immediate gain but for strategic value, and Luciano applied the same organizational and psychological principles to business as he had to governance, alliances, and rivalry. Gambling became a cornerstone of his empire. Casinos, illegal betting parlors, and underground card rooms were organized with meticulous attention to detail. Luciano's operations were more than games of chance, they were instruments of control. They allowed him to cultivate alliances with politicians, law enforcement, and other influential figures who could be swayed with a cut of the profits. At the same time, they provided a continuous flow of cash, funding other enterprises and reinforcing the perception of his invincibility. Gambling was not just a source of wealth, it was a tool for psychological dominance. Victims of swindling or intimidation learned quickly to respect the authority of the house, while allies understood the mutual benefit of compliance. Luciano had effectively turned vice into a disciplined, structured enterprise that operated with the efficiency of a legitimate business. Bootlegging, of course, was another vital pillar. The Prohibition era provided an unprecedented opportunity for ambitious criminals to expand influence and accumulate vast wealth. Luciano recognized that alcohol was more than a commodity, it was leverage. Distribution networks required coordination, trust, and discipline, all of which he had already mastered within his reorganized mafia. He controlled supply chains, dictated territory, and managed relationships with suppliers and enforcers alike. Violence was used sparingly and strategically, not as a default solution but as a method of negotiation and compliance. In the shadows of speakeasies and hidden warehouses, Luciano built a system that maximized profit while minimizing unnecessary risk. His ability to integrate these operations into a coherent, multifaceted empire distinguished him from competitors and elevated him from a local gangster to a figure of national influence. Equally innovative was his involvement with labor unions and organized corruption within industries. Luciano understood that control over unions was more than a side operation, it was a method of expanding influence, ensuring compliance, and generating consistent revenue. By placing loyal allies in positions of authority, he could manipulate contracts, extort businesses, and direct work to favored enterprises, creating an additional layer of both profit and power. This approach blurred the lines between legitimate business and criminal enterprise, demonstrating his ability to navigate complex social, economic, and political environments. Luciano's operations were thus multidimensional, they generated cash, reinforced authority, and extended his reach into sectors that would have been inaccessible to ordinary criminals. By treating crime as a business, he created a system that was self-sustaining, resilient, and extraordinarily lucrative. Luciano's approach to business was also deeply psychological. He understood that people respond to incentives and consequences, that fear and loyalty can be manipulated to produce desired behavior. Employees, associates, and rivals all operated within a framework of rewards and punishments that Luciano carefully calibrated. Generosity and opportunity built allegiance, intimidation and swift retribution maintained discipline. The precision of this psychological management allowed him to scale operations far beyond what was possible in previous generations of criminal enterprises. His network was disciplined not just by rules or oversight but by an intricate understanding of human nature, anticipation of behavior, and mastery of influence. In essence, Luciano was as much a strategist of the mind as he was of money and territory. At the same time, Luciano was careful to shield himself from exposure. He understood that visibility was a liability in the criminal underworld and in the eyes of law enforcement. By delegating operational tasks to trusted lieutenants and maintaining layers of plausible deniability, he insulated himself from the day-to-day risks while retaining ultimate control. This delegation also allowed the network to grow exponentially, with individual operators managing their respective domains while contributing to the larger system. Each layer of hierarchy was reinforced with loyalty, fear, and interdependence, ensuring that the removal of any single player would not collapse the network. Luciano's genius lay in this combination of decentralization and control, a model that would influence organized crime for decades. The economic impact of his operations extended far beyond the underworld. Through gambling, bootlegging, and union manipulation, Luciano infiltrated legitimate sectors, influencing businesses, politics, and law enforcement. His ability to blend coercion, negotiation, and strategy meant that his empire operated simultaneously above and below the law, creating a landscape in which compliance was preferable to confrontation for those who crossed paths with him. This duality, visible authority coupled with hidden control, amplified his power. He had learned that influence is most effective when it is both pervasive and subtle, when people comply not only out of fear but out of recognition of a system that is smarter, more efficient, and more inescapable than themselves. Even within his organization, Luciano cultivated a culture of professionalism. Associates were expected to adhere to strict codes of conduct, understanding that discipline and reliability were essential for the sustainability of the enterprise. Operations were planned with careful attention to timing, risk management, and contingency. Opportunities were evaluated strategically, with decisions guided not by impulse but by careful calculation. In doing so, Luciano transformed crime from a chaotic, reactive enterprise into a disciplined, strategic operation. His mafia was no longer merely a collection of thugs and enforcers, it was a coordinated network of influence, intelligence, and calculated action. By the end of this period, Luciano had not only amassed considerable wealth but also built a system that amplified his power far beyond his physical presence. He had demonstrated that criminal enterprises could be managed with the same sophistication as legitimate businesses, blending finance, psychology, and strategy into a seamless whole. His operations in gambling, bootlegging, and union control were not isolated ventures but interconnected mechanisms of influence, each reinforcing the other and magnifying his authority. Through this combination of innovation, discipline, and vision, Luciano established himself as a figure whose power extended across Brooklyn, New York, and eventually the nation, a man whose understanding of both human nature and organizational systems allowed him to dominate the underworld like no one before him. By the time Luciano had established himself as a dominant figure in Brooklyn, the network of alliances and rivalries around him had grown complex and precarious. Power in the underworld was never absolute, it depended as much on perception as on action, and loyalty was a fragile commodity. Luciano understood that to maintain control, he needed not only resources and muscle but also the intelligence to navigate human relationships with precision. Allies could provide support, information, and access to territory, while enemies could destroy an empire with a single miscalculation. The delicate balance between friendship, fear, and strategic alliance became his most vital concern, and his ability to manage these relationships with both ruthlessness and subtlety would define his rise. The young Don had an uncanny ability to read people. He understood motivations, desires, and insecurities in a way that few of his contemporaries could. A casual word, a gesture, even the smallest hesitation in an associate could reveal allegiance or threat. He surrounded himself with individuals whose talents complemented his vision, enforcers who could inspire fear, negotiators who could extract compliance, and operatives who could manage the growing complexities of a multi-layered criminal enterprise. Each ally was carefully chosen not merely for loyalty but for utility. Luciano recognized that an empire built on untested loyalty was fragile, whereas one constructed through strategic alliances and calculated control could withstand pressure from rivals, law enforcement, and internal dissent. Rivalries, however, were unavoidable. Brooklyn, like much of the American underworld, was a patchwork of competing interests, each seeking to expand influence and profit. Some opponents were brash, acting on impulse, while others were cunning, observing and striking when least expected. Luciano learned quickly that timing, patience, and psychological insight were often more effective than brute force. He could neutralize threats through intimidation, negotiation, or carefully orchestrated displays of power, and he understood that the fear of reprisal often worked more effectively than violence itself. In this, he demonstrated a sophistication unmatched by many of his peers, blending diplomacy with the implicit threat of lethal consequence, ensuring that his authority was both respected and unchallenged. Betrayal was a constant risk, and Luciano's genius was in anticipating it before it could destabilize his operations. He maintained a network of informants and confidants, individuals whose loyalty could be verified through both observation and action. Those who faltered, who wavered in allegiance, were either removed from the network or reminded of the consequences of betrayal in a manner both symbolic and effective. Fear, he understood, was only part of the equation. Respect, earned through both charisma and calculated action, was equally vital. By balancing these elements, Luciano created an environment where allies were motivated not just by coercion but by admiration, ambition, and the understanding that their success was intertwined with his own. The landscape of alliances also extended beyond the Italian-American mafia. Luciano recognized the value of pragmatism over ethnic loyalty. Jewish and Irish criminals controlled important segments of bootlegging, gambling, and labor rackets, and alliances with these groups were not only profitable but strategically essential. By cultivating these cross-cultural partnerships, Luciano expanded his operational reach and reduced the number of enemies he faced. He understood that influence in the underworld was relational and that collaboration could stabilize territories and maximize profits in ways that unilateral dominance could not. This approach demonstrated a level of sophistication and vision rare in organized crime. He was not just a gangster but a strategist, orchestrating a web of loyalty and obligation that transcended old rivalries. Psychology played a central role in managing allies and enemies alike. Luciano knew that people respond predictably to fear, reward, and reputation. He deployed all three with remarkable skill. An act of loyalty could secure an associate's devotion, while a carefully timed threat could neutralize a rival without violence. Reputation, once established, became a self-reinforcing tool. Those who respected his intelligence and foresight often submitted to his authority before conflict could arise. In effect, Luciano controlled not only actions but perceptions, creating an environment in which compliance was the rational choice for most who encountered him. His empire was thus built not merely on power but on the management of perception, trust, and calculated fear. Luciano's personal relationships further complicated this web of power. Romantic entanglements, friendships, and family ties all intersected with his criminal enterprise, creating vulnerabilities as well as opportunities. He was known for his charisma and charm, traits that could inspire loyalty, manipulate adversaries, or cement alliances. Yet these same relationships required careful navigation, as emotional entanglements could expose him to betrayal or manipulation. He learned to maintain a delicate balance, leveraging personal connections strategically while avoiding the pitfalls of unchecked intimacy. In doing so, he demonstrated an acute understanding of human nature. Personal loyalty could be a weapon, but it could also be a liability if mishandled. The stakes of these alliances and rivalries were never abstract, they were immediate, often violent, and always consequential. A misjudged alliance could lead to territorial losses, financial setbacks, or even death. Every decision carried weight, and Luciano's ability to navigate this landscape with precision was a testament to both his intellect and his nerve. Allies were instruments of strategy, rivals were challenges to be anticipated, and every interaction was a potential pivot point in a larger game of control. Through this lens, his rise was as much psychological as it was operational. He did not simply conquer through violence, but through manipulation, foresight, and the orchestration of human behavior. By the end of this period, Luciano had transformed from a street-level hustler into a master of complex networks. His alliances were extensive, his enemies carefully monitored, and his reputation had begun to reach far beyond Brooklyn. He was no longer merely a participant in the underworld, he was an architect of influence, orchestrating loyalty and fear across multiple layers of criminal enterprise. Every ally was chosen, every enemy observed, and every decision calculated to reinforce both his authority and his vision. In managing these relationships, Luciano revealed the depth of his genius. He was not simply building an empire of money or muscle, but an enduring system of psychological, strategic, and operational control that would define the modern mafia for generations to come. Beneath the public face of his empire, a hidden war was always simmering. The streets, neighborhoods, and speakeasies of New York were not merely venues for profit, they were battlegrounds for influence, control, and survival. Rival families, dissatisfied lieutenants, and ambitious outsiders constantly tested the limits of Luciano's authority. In this shadowed landscape, violence was only one tool among many. Strategy, intelligence, and psychological manipulation were equally essential. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to operate simultaneously on multiple fronts. He could negotiate with enemies, enforce loyalty among allies, and maintain an almost invisible presence that ensured his dominance, all while minimizing direct exposure to danger. The underworld was a living organism, and he had become its master tactician, anticipating shifts before they erupted and responding with precision. Conflicts often emerged from the most mundane causes. A disputed gambling territory, a bootlegging route, or a perceived slight could escalate into bloodshed if not carefully managed. Unlike impulsive rivals, Luciano approached every challenge with calculated foresight. He understood that raw aggression might solve a short-term problem but could trigger long-term instability, drawing law enforcement scrutiny or inspiring retaliation. Instead, he favored a blend of intimidation, diplomacy, and strategic violence. A subtle threat could realign loyalties, a well-timed act of generosity could secure an ally's devotion, and a precise strike could neutralize a rival without unleashing unnecessary chaos. This combination of tactics allowed him to maintain authority in a volatile environment while building a reputation for intelligence, cunning, and ruthlessness. One of the most dangerous aspects of this hidden war was the constant pressure from within his own ranks. Ambitious lieutenants and associates could easily become rivals, testing his control or challenging his authority. Luciano knew that internal betrayal could be more threatening than external attacks because it carried the weight of trust and proximity. To mitigate this risk, he established a system of surveillance, loyalty tests, and selective rewards. He cultivated relationships where ambition was channeled in ways that reinforced his vision rather than undermined it. Those who proved reliable were elevated and entrusted with critical responsibilities, those who faltered faced consequences that reinforced the perception of his omniscience. In this, he demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human behavior. By managing ambition, fear, and loyalty simultaneously, he ensured stability within a structure that was inherently precarious. Rival families were another source of continuous tension. The fractured nature of the American mafia meant that power was never centralized, and the ambitions of other bosses could easily disrupt the delicate balance. Luciano's ability to navigate these dynamics was unparalleled. He brokered alliances with certain families while isolating or neutralizing others, always mindful of the broader strategic picture. The creation of the Commission, which served as both a governing body and a mediation tool, allowed him to formalize mechanisms for conflict resolution, reducing the likelihood of uncontrolled warfare. Even when violence erupted, it was carefully orchestrated to send clear messages without destabilizing the overall system. By controlling both the perception and the reality of power, Luciano was able to exert influence far beyond what his physical presence would suggest. The hidden war also extended beyond New York. With bootlegging and gambling operations stretching into multiple states, rival interests from Chicago, Philadelphia, and beyond presented both threats and opportunities. Luciano understood that managing these extended networks required a combination of diplomacy, negotiation, and selective force. He maintained channels of communication with distant allies and rivals, carefully balancing competing interests to prevent escalation while maximizing his reach and profit. This strategic foresight allowed him to operate on a national scale, projecting power in ways that few contemporaries could imagine. He was not merely a Brooklyn gangster, he had become a national figure whose influence shaped the criminal landscape across the United States. Law enforcement pressure added yet another layer of complexity. Police, federal agents, and political authorities were constantly attempting to dismantle his operations, yet Luciano managed to stay several steps ahead. He understood that the appearance of invincibility was as important as actual security. Through bribery, intelligence networks, and careful operational compartmentalization, he insulated himself from direct prosecution while ensuring that his enterprises continued to function. Associates were empowered to act independently but under strict oversight, allowing the system to thrive even under intense scrutiny. This approach minimized exposure while maximizing operational effectiveness, a hallmark of Luciano's strategic genius. Survival tactics in this hidden war were not limited to operational strategy, they extended to personal discipline and psychological resilience. Luciano recognized that maintaining control in a volatile environment required both mental acuity and emotional fortitude. He cultivated an aura of calm authority, projecting confidence even when navigating treacherous circumstances. His ability to remain composed under pressure reinforced the perception of his dominance and ensured that allies remained loyal while rivals hesitated. This psychological mastery became a key weapon in the hidden war, as perception often dictated outcomes even more than brute strength or wealth. Those who underestimated him quickly learned that Luciano's control extended beyond action into the very minds of those around him. Through these years, Luciano's reputation for cunning and decisiveness solidified. Stories of his strategic brilliance, calculated strikes, and ability to command loyalty spread through the underworld. He became known not only for the empire he was building but for the intelligence and foresight with which he operated. Rivals feared confrontation, allies sought his protection, and the public barely glimpsed the true scope of his influence. The hidden war, waged in alleys, back rooms, and across state lines, was a testament to his understanding of power as a psychological and strategic enterprise, not merely a function of violence. He had learned to manage chaos, manipulate perception, and engineer outcomes with precision, turning what might have been a life defined by constant danger into a calculated ascent to unparalleled authority. By the end of this period, Luciano's mastery of the hidden war positioned him as the unchallenged architect of modern organized crime. Every alliance, rivalry, and confrontation had been shaped by foresight, strategy, and psychological acuity. His ability to navigate complex networks of influence, anticipate threats, and maintain control in a volatile environment set him apart from every contemporary and predecessor. The streets, once arenas of random violence, had become the proving ground for a mind that understood the subtle calculus of power, loyalty, and survival. In mastering this hidden war, Luciano not only preserved his empire but also laid the groundwork for the global reputation and influence he would come to wield in the years ahead. Despite his meticulously constructed empire and careful orchestration of loyalty, the cracks in Luciano's world began to show as the 1930s unfolded. Power, no matter how brilliantly wielded, attracts attention, from allies who covet it, from rivals who envy it, and from law enforcement determined to dismantle it. For all his genius in organization, manipulation, and control, Luciano was not immune to the vulnerabilities inherent in a life built on crime. One misstep, one betrayal, one unforeseen shift in loyalty could unravel years of planning. And so, even as he projected invincibility, he was forced to navigate an increasingly treacherous landscape, where every shadow could conceal a threat and every handshake might mask a dagger poised for his back. The beginning of his downfall was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Rivals who had long simmered in the background sensed weakness or opportunity and began testing boundaries. Minor conflicts escalated as loyalties shifted and alliances frayed under pressure. Luciano had spent years orchestrating the relationships around him with precision, but in a world where ambition is as volatile as it is constant, even the most disciplined networks are fragile. Former allies, once bound by respect and mutual benefit, now questioned his authority, tempted by promises of greater power or wealth. The very structure he had painstakingly built, layers of loyalty, fear, and strategic control, was suddenly exposed to the pressures of human ambition, betrayal, and law enforcement scrutiny. At the same time, law enforcement intensified their focus on organized crime, emboldened by public outrage over the violence, corruption, and bootlegging that defined the era. Investigators, prosecutors, and federal agents began closing in, leveraging informants, surveillance, and a growing appetite for high-profile convictions. Luciano, always careful to maintain layers of insulation and plausible deniability, now faced an increasingly sophisticated and relentless force. Even the most meticulous operational precautions could not fully shield him from the consequences of past actions. It was a reminder that while he could manipulate people and control networks, he could not fully control the reach of the law or the unpredictability of human behavior. Betrayal, the invisible knife that Luciano had always feared, emerged from unexpected quarters. Associates who had benefited from his empire, who owed loyalty, were tempted by the prospect of immunity or reduced sentences offered by prosecutors. Others, motivated by resentment or ambition, sought to exploit the vulnerability created by the increasing legal pressure. Luciano had long understood that betrayal could come from those closest to him, and he had attempted to preempt it through surveillance, loyalty tests, and psychological control. Yet, the magnitude of law enforcement pressure and the promise of personal advantage created cracks in even the strongest bonds. Friends became witnesses, confidants became informants, and the network that had once been his fortress now threatened to become the instrument of his undoing. The arrest itself was dramatic, the culmination of years of investigation, surveillance, and meticulous legal maneuvering. It was a moment that exposed both the fragility and the resilience of Luciano's empire. Though the hand of law enforcement had finally reached him, it also revealed the extent to which he had insulated himself. The operations continued, associates managed day-to-day affairs, and communication channels remained intact. Yet the psychological impact was undeniable. The arrest was more than a legal setback, it was a crack in the armor of invincibility that he had cultivated for years. Rivals sensed vulnerability, allies reassessed loyalty, and the public witnessed a dramatic fall from the shadowy heights of power he had carefully maintained. For Luciano, the challenge was no longer purely operational, it was existential, testing both his strategic mind and his ability to survive under the most intense pressure of his life. The trial that followed was equally high stakes. The courtroom became a stage where reputation, perception, and legal strategy were as critical as evidence. Media coverage turned the proceedings into a spectacle, amplifying the drama of a man who had seemed untouchable. Prosecutors sought to portray him as the embodiment of organized crime's ruthlessness, a symbol of corruption and lawlessness. Luciano, aware of the stakes, approached the trial with the same strategic mind he had applied to every aspect of his empire. He weighed risks, managed appearances, and considered the psychological impact of every word and gesture. Even in the theater of justice, he understood that influence and perception could shape outcomes in ways that extended beyond the literal facts of the case. Betrayal continued to shape this period. Allies and lieutenants, pressured by law enforcement or swayed by personal gain, provided testimony that challenged his authority and exposed operational details. Luciano's ability to anticipate and manipulate human behavior had kept him ahead for decades, but now the pressures of law and human ambition converged in ways that even he could not fully control. The trial highlighted the precarious balance of power he had maintained. His genius in orchestration was evident, yet the vulnerabilities inherent in a criminal empire, ambition, fear, betrayal, and legal exposure, had finally become undeniable. Each revelation, each testimony, eroded the perception of invincibility that had been central to his strategy of control. Even as the empire he had built faced scrutiny and partial dismantlement, Luciano's resilience was evident. He adapted, responded, and maneuvered within the constraints imposed by arrest and prosecution. Strategic alliances were leveraged to maintain operational continuity, psychological tactics were deployed to manage loyalty and perception among associates, and calculated gestures of compliance or defiance were employed to influence public and legal perception. The beginning of his downfall was therefore not a simple collapse but a complex interplay of legal pressure, human ambition, and the challenges of maintaining control in an increasingly hostile environment. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to navigate these forces, even as they threatened to overwhelm the empire he had constructed with such care. By the end of this period, it was clear that Luciano's rise had entered a new phase, one defined by vulnerability, strategic calculation under pressure, and the looming possibility of permanent disruption. The arrest and betrayal marked the beginning of a sequence that would ultimately redefine his life, his empire, and the structure of organized crime itself. He was no longer merely a master of alliances and networks, he was a man confronting the consequences of decades of ambition in a world where loyalty was fragile, rivals were vigilant, and the law was closing in. The hidden war of strategy, fear, and manipulation had transformed into a visible struggle for survival, one that would test the full measure of Luciano's cunning, resilience, and understanding of human nature. The courtroom became a theater in which Luciano's fate was no longer dictated by street alliances or the strategic orchestration of criminal enterprises, but by law, public perception, and the intricate machinery of justice. For the first time in years, the invincible architect of the modern mafia found himself under scrutiny that extended far beyond the underworld. The trial was a spectacle, a collision of power, reputation, and moral judgment that captivated the public and the press. Newspapers ran bold headlines, sensationalizing every development, every allegation, and every testimony, casting Luciano as both the embodiment of organized crime and the man who had eluded justice for far too long. The media frenzy amplified the stakes, turning a legal proceeding into a national event and forcing Luciano to confront the consequences of a life spent in shadows. From the opening days of the trial, it was clear that prosecutors were intent on not only securing a conviction but shaping the narrative of Luciano as a symbol of corruption and menace. Witnesses came forward with accounts that detailed the inner workings of his criminal network, exposing operations in gambling, bootlegging, and labor manipulation. Each testimony was a calculated move in the prosecution's effort to depict a man whose intellect and ambition had been deployed exclusively in the service of lawlessness. Luciano, however, remained composed. Years of managing human behavior, predicting rival actions, and controlling perception had prepared him for confrontation on this stage. Every gesture, glance, and word was measured, projecting calm authority even as the legal machinery sought to dismantle the empire he had painstakingly constructed. The courtroom drama was intensified by the interplay of betrayal and loyalty. Associates who had once operated under his authority, bound by fear and respect, now faced the pressures of testimony, immunity deals, and the prospect of reduced sentences. Some chose to cooperate with the prosecution, their testimonies unraveling elements of Luciano's operations and revealing the very structure that had made him formidable. Others remained steadfast, protecting the secrets of the organization and demonstrating the enduring strength of loyalty forged through a combination of fear, respect, and strategic benefit. Luciano had long understood that betrayal was a constant threat, yet the scale and immediacy of these courtroom revelations presented a new challenge, testing both his strategic acumen and his psychological resilience. Despite these pressures, Luciano's mastery of perception remained a critical asset. He projected the image of a man unshaken, a figure of calm intelligence amidst chaos. He understood that public perception, much like the loyalty of allies, could be managed through careful presentation and strategic communication. Lawyers, strategists, and trusted confidants worked to reinforce this image, highlighting inconsistencies in prosecution testimonies and emphasizing gaps in evidence. While the law sought to punish him, Luciano sought to maintain control over the narrative, to assert, even in court, that the architect of the modern mafia was a man of intellect, foresight, and unyielding discipline. His reputation for composure and strategic thinking, cultivated over years on the streets and in organized networks, now became a psychological tool in the courtroom itself. Sentencing marked the culmination of this high-stakes drama, a moment where the abstract concepts of power, fear, and loyalty intersected with the tangible consequences of law. Luciano faced not only the loss of personal freedom but the temporary disruption of the empire he had so meticulously built. The decision of the court carried weight far beyond the individual. It was a symbolic victory for law enforcement and a pivotal turning point in the history of organized crime. For those within his network, it was a test of resilience, loyalty, and adaptability. Allies were compelled to navigate operational continuity without their leader, while rivals gauged the extent to which the vacuum of authority could be exploited. In this moment, the fragile equilibrium of the underworld was exposed, and the balance of power, long maintained by Luciano's intellect and foresight, was suddenly in question. Yet even in the shadow of conviction, Luciano's strategic mind remained active. He understood that imprisonment was not an absolute defeat but a temporary condition to be managed. Through intermediaries, coded communication, and trusted lieutenants, he continued to exert influence over operations, ensuring that the empire adapted to the constraints imposed by his absence. The courtroom, the trial, and the sentencing were all components of a larger game, in which the visible loss of freedom was counterbalanced by ongoing control and strategic positioning. Luciano's ability to maneuver psychologically, operationally, and strategically in this context demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that had been hallmarks of his rise, confirming that even when constrained, he remained a formidable force within the underworld. The trial also underscored the intricate interplay between criminal innovation and public accountability. Luciano had built his empire on intelligence, structure, and psychological insight, and the courtroom forced a confrontation with the consequences of this innovation. Media coverage amplified the narrative of moral reckoning, turning Luciano's personal and operational decisions into matters of national discussion. Yet the courtroom also revealed the enduring sophistication of his empire. Despite legal scrutiny and public condemnation, the networks he had constructed continued to function, allies remained loyal, and the principles of control, hierarchy, and psychological management persisted beyond the immediate pressures of law. The sentencing was therefore both a setback and a demonstration of enduring influence. By the conclusion of this trial, Luciano had confronted one of the most challenging tests of his career. The courtroom had exposed vulnerabilities, highlighted betrayals, and subjected him to intense scrutiny, yet it also illustrated the resilience and adaptability that had defined his rise. The combination of strategic foresight, psychological control, and operational sophistication allowed him to navigate this crucible without total collapse. While freedom had been curtailed, influence and authority persisted, reinforcing the reality that Luciano's genius was not merely in action but in anticipation, perception, and the management of complex human networks. The sentencing was both an end and a beginning, a moment of personal consequence that would reshape the trajectory of his empire while confirming the enduring power of a man who had redefined organized crime. Even behind the imposing walls of prison, Luciano's influence did not waver. For many, incarceration would have marked the end of authority, the severing of ties to power, and the collapse of carefully constructed networks. For Luciano, it was a challenge to be managed with the same intelligence, foresight, and psychological acuity that had defined his rise. He understood that control was not merely a function of proximity, it was a function of perception, reputation, and the strategic deployment of loyal intermediaries. Through a combination of trusted lieutenants, coded messages, and carefully cultivated networks, he continued to direct operations, ensuring that the machinery of his empire ran smoothly even in his physical absence. The prison, rather than being a terminus, became another arena in which his mastery of influence and strategy could be exercised. Within the prison walls, Luciano carefully maintained the image of authority. He projected calm, intelligence, and composure, a demeanor that reinforced his reputation as untouchable even when physically confined. Fellow inmates, guards, and visitors were all subtly reminded that power could extend beyond walls, and that Luciano's reach remained formidable. Through intermediaries, he communicated orders, coordinated activities, and maintained oversight over his associates on the outside. Each instruction was precise, ensuring that operations continued without interruption, while also minimizing the risk of exposure or law enforcement detection. His ability to orchestrate activity at a distance demonstrated a level of strategic sophistication rarely seen, transforming confinement into a calculated exercise in long-range control. Luciano's influence extended into the daily operations of the mafia, where his directives shaped decisions on territory, personnel, and revenue. Trusted lieutenants assumed greater responsibility, empowered to execute strategies that reflected his vision while also reporting back with information on results and challenges. This delegation was not a relinquishment of power but a demonstration of its enduring structure. By creating layers of loyalty, accountability, and surveillance, Luciano ensured that authority remained centralized in his vision, even as operational autonomy was granted. The network he had built was resilient, capable of functioning efficiently without his constant physical oversight, a testament to his foresight in designing both the structure and the culture of his empire. Communication became a critical tool. Luciano relied on intermediaries who understood the stakes, individuals skilled in navigating both loyalty and deception. Messages were carefully crafted, sometimes coded, sometimes symbolic, conveying instructions while minimizing the risk of interception. Through this system, he could influence financial decisions, mediate disputes, and manage crises without direct involvement. Every directive reinforced his authority, ensuring that associates recognized the source of power and continued to act in alignment with his strategic objectives. In effect, Luciano transformed the limitations of incarceration into an extension of his influence, demonstrating that physical confinement could not negate mental and operational dominance. Psychologically, Luciano leveraged fear, respect, and loyalty to maintain control. His reputation as a mastermind of strategy and consequence meant that even in prison, rivals and potential defectors hesitated. Actions were measured against the potential repercussions of crossing him, and loyalty remained a rational choice for those dependent on the empire he had constructed. He understood that perception was as critical as reality. The belief that Luciano's power extended beyond walls was sufficient to guide behavior, ensuring compliance and operational stability. In this way, his psychological command became a strategic asset, reinforcing both internal discipline and external influence. The continuity of Luciano's operations during his imprisonment was further aided by his adaptability. He adjusted his methods to account for reduced mobility, increased scrutiny, and the shifting dynamics of his organization. Where previously he could intervene directly, he now relied on intermediaries, incentives, and the careful orchestration of perception to maintain order. These adaptations highlight a critical aspect of his genius, the ability to maintain influence not through brute force alone, but through strategic foresight, understanding of human behavior, and mastery of complex systems. Even constrained, he remained the central figure in a network of power that continued to operate with precision and purpose. Despite incarceration, Luciano also used this period to observe, reflect, and refine his strategies. He gained insights into the resilience of his empire, the loyalty of his associates, and the vulnerabilities exposed by legal scrutiny. The prison experience, while challenging, provided an opportunity to test the robustness of his organizational design and the efficacy of delegated authority. By analyzing failures and successes from this vantage point, Luciano could make informed decisions for future operations, both inside and outside the confines of prison. In this way, confinement became not a defeat but a laboratory for strategy, reinforcing his role as a calculated and forward-thinking leader. Luciano's capacity to maintain control from prison also underscored the depth of loyalty and discipline within his network. Associates continued operations because they were embedded in a culture of obedience, mutual benefit, and fear of reprisal. The structures he had built, hierarchies, codes of conduct, and communication channels, ensured continuity even under extreme pressure. Each decision, each act of compliance, reinforced the system, demonstrating that Luciano's authority was not dependent on physical presence but on a meticulously cultivated combination of culture, psychology, and strategic oversight. By the end of this period, it was clear that Luciano's empire had survived not merely by luck or residual power but through deliberate design. Prison, a circumstance that would have destroyed lesser leaders, became a testament to his mastery of human behavior, organizational strategy, and long-range influence. His operations continued, his authority remained recognized, and his network adapted to maintain both profit and control. Luciano had demonstrated that true power is not bound by walls or limitations, it is constructed through vision, foresight, and the ability to command loyalty, fear, and respect across distance, time, and circumstance. In mastering control from within confinement, he solidified his place as one of the most intelligent and formidable figures in the history of organized crime. Deportation to Sicily marked a profound turning point in Luciano's life, a sudden and dramatic shift from the corridors of power in New York to the unfamiliar streets of his ancestral homeland. The transition was jarring, both physically and psychologically. America had been the stage upon which he had exercised unparalleled control, a place where his intellect, foresight, and charisma had allowed him to build a criminal empire that spanned cities and industries. In Sicily, however, he found himself stripped of the intricate networks that had made him untouchable. The familiar faces of trusted lieutenants were gone, the mechanisms of influence he had meticulously constructed were dismantled, and the empire he had dominated for decades was suddenly beyond his reach. This exile was not merely a geographical displacement, it was a profound confrontation with loss, powerlessness, and the limits of control. Yet even in exile, Luciano's mind remained active, probing for opportunities, analyzing the environment, and recalibrating his strategies. Sicily was a landscape rich with history and culture, but it was also a terrain of local allegiances, rivalries, and traditional structures of influence that were deeply embedded and not immediately amenable to outside control. Luciano, always a keen observer, recognized that power in this context required patience, subtlety, and a deep understanding of human nature. He navigated relationships cautiously, establishing connections with local figures, testing loyalties, and studying the social and political dynamics that govern daily life. Exile forced him to shift from the aggressive orchestration of empire building to a more reflective, adaptive, and long-term approach to influence. The isolation of deportation also prompted a philosophical transformation. Removed from the immediate pursuit of power and the constant management of operations, Luciano had the opportunity to reflect on the nature of his life, his choices, and the consequences of ambition. The streets of New York, once vibrant arenas of action and strategy, became memories, intense, vivid, and tinged with both pride and regret. He grappled with the moral ambiguities that had guided his rise, the betrayals he had witnessed and orchestrated, and the fragile balance between loyalty and fear that had defined his empire. Exile was, in many ways, a forced introspection, a period in which the man behind the myth could consider not only what he had achieved but also what he had sacrificed. Despite the constraints of his environment, Luciano's influence continued to ripple outward. He maintained connections with American associates, intermediaries, and contacts who remained loyal to him across borders. Through correspondence and trusted emissaries, he offered advice, mediated disputes, and even influenced strategic decisions, albeit at a distance. While the scale of his authority was diminished, the mechanisms he had perfected, psychological insight, strategic foresight, and the ability to command loyalty, remained operative. His presence, even in exile, was felt in the continuing operations of his former network, a testament to the enduring structures he had built and the cultural weight of his reputation. Sicily itself presented unique challenges and opportunities. Local power structures were deeply entrenched, often resistant to external interference, and governed by centuries-old codes of honor, loyalty, and retribution. Luciano had to navigate these carefully, balancing respect for tradition with the subtle assertion of influence. He cultivated relationships with individuals whose position or knowledge could offer him leverage, establishing alliances that were strategic, cautious, and often long-term in nature. Whereas his rise in New York had been characterized by direct action, decisive confrontation, and aggressive network expansion, his exile required diplomacy, observation, and a nuanced understanding of context. In this environment, patience became a critical asset, and Luciano's adaptability was tested as never before. The psychological impact of exile was profound. Stripped of immediate authority, of the constant flow of information and power, Luciano confronted vulnerability and mortality in a way that had been largely absent during his years of dominance. He experienced firsthand the limits of human control, the fragility of even the most well-constructed networks, and the inevitability of change. This period forced a confrontation with the human dimensions of power, ambition, loyalty, fear, and consequence. Luciano's reflection on these elements was not purely introspective, it informed the way he engaged with his environment, the strategies he deployed to maintain influence, and the measured patience with which he approached opportunities. Exile became both a crucible and a laboratory for psychological and strategic refinement. Luciano's final years in Sicily were marked by this duality, a retreat from the immediacy of operational command combined with the sustained exercise of strategic influence from afar. He became a figure whose presence was symbolic as much as practical, a living reminder to associates in America and Sicily alike that his intellect, experience, and authority remained potent despite physical displacement. The exile, rather than erasing his significance, reframed it, highlighting the enduring value of foresight, psychological mastery, and the ability to command loyalty through reputation and subtle orchestration. In these years, Luciano evolved from a man defined by action to a strategist defined by insight, reflection, and enduring influence. By the end of his life in Sicily, Luciano had undergone a transformation that was both philosophical and practical. The man who had built an empire through audacity, intelligence, and ruthlessness now understood the limits of control, the impermanence of dominance, and the profound interplay between power, perception, and circumstance. Exile had forced a confrontation with vulnerability, mortality, and consequence, yet it also affirmed the enduring potency of his intellect and strategic vision. In this final chapter, Luciano's life reflected a remarkable evolution, from the aggressive orchestration of criminal empire to a reflective, measured, and psychologically sophisticated exercise in influence, demonstrating that true mastery of power is not merely about control in the moment but understanding, anticipation, and adaptation across time and circumstance. Luciano's legacy is a complex tapestry of ingenuity, ruthlessness, and innovation, stretching far beyond the streets of Brooklyn or the shores of Sicily. While many figures in the criminal underworld fade into obscurity, he remains a defining force whose methods, structures, and psychological strategies reshaped organized crime on a global scale. His greatest achievement was not merely the accumulation of wealth or territory but the creation of a system, an architecture of power that could endure beyond his presence, survive legal pressures, and adapt to changing circumstances. He transformed what had once been fragmented, chaotic operations into a disciplined, business-like organization with clearly defined hierarchies, rules, and channels of communication. In doing so, Luciano elevated organized crime from a matter of brute force and opportunism to a model of strategic sophistication. The most enduring aspect of his influence was the establishment of the Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes, regulate competition, and maintain a balance of power among the mafia families. This innovation was revolutionary, formalizing a structure that replaced the unpredictable cycles of violence and retribution that had previously defined the underworld. The Commission allowed for strategic collaboration, long-term planning, and a semblance of governance in a world otherwise defined by chaos. It was a testament to Luciano's vision. He understood that sustainable power required not only control over men and money but also systems, procedures, and norms that could withstand the inevitable fluctuations of ambition and betrayal. This institutional legacy became the blueprint for organized crime across America and influenced criminal networks worldwide. Luciano's psychological mastery also defined his legacy. He demonstrated an uncanny ability to read people, predict behavior, and manipulate both allies and rivals in ways that maximized loyalty and minimized threat. Fear, respect, and reputation became tools as essential as muscle and money. He understood that influence is as much about perception as it is about action, and he cultivated an image of invincibility that amplified his operational effectiveness. Future generations of crime figures studied this interplay of psychological strategy and practical authority, recognizing that the true power of a leader lies not merely in physical dominance but in the capacity to shape thought, behavior, and expectation across a network. Luciano's methods elevated the intelligence of organized crime, making it as much a game of strategy as a pursuit of profit. The scope of his impact was not limited to criminal enterprises. Luciano's activities intersected with social, political, and economic systems, particularly during Prohibition and the years following. He forged cross-cultural alliances, integrated diverse criminal groups into cohesive operations, and leveraged political and institutional corruption to his advantage. His vision extended beyond immediate gain, encompassing long-term influence, stability, and growth. By organizing the underworld with business principles, he created a model that was resilient under legal and social pressures, demonstrating that criminal empires could function with operational sophistication comparable to legitimate enterprises. This systemic approach influenced generations of organized crime figures, establishing norms and strategies that remain relevant decades later. Even in popular culture, Luciano's legacy endures. The archetype of the intelligent, strategic, and ruthless crime boss, calm under pressure, perceptive, and always several steps ahead, owes much to the real-life example he set. Films, literature, and documentaries often draw on his life not merely for its sensational episodes but for the underlying psychology, strategic brilliance, and organizational genius it reveals. His story resonates because it blends action with intellect, ambition with morality, and audacity with foresight. The mythology surrounding him is inseparable from the tangible impact of his methods, and this interplay between legend and reality contributes to his enduring fascination. Luciano's innovations also reshaped the ethical and operational landscape of organized crime. By establishing rules, codes, and governance structures, he created a framework in which loyalty, negotiation, and strategic planning became as critical as force. Violence, once spontaneous and chaotic, was now calibrated and purposeful, employed strategically to consolidate power, enforce loyalty, or resolve conflicts. This approach reduced inefficiency, stabilized networks, and created long-term operational continuity. Future criminal leaders adopted these principles, and the model of governance he established, the commission, the codes, the management of loyalty and fear, remained foundational in organized crime long after his death. Perhaps the most subtle aspect of his legacy lies in the psychological lessons he imparted through action. He demonstrated that true influence is not merely imposed but earned through intelligence, foresight, and the careful orchestration of perception. Allies and rivals alike recognized his acumen, and even in the absence of physical presence, his strategies continued to shape outcomes. The capacity to maintain authority across distance, legal pressure, and shifting circumstances set a new standard for what leadership in the underworld could entail. Luciano's life illustrated that power is both a practical and psychological construct, and mastery requires understanding human behavior, anticipating change, and structuring systems capable of enduring disruption. By the time of his death, Luciano's empire had been diminished in some respects, yet his influence remained profound. The structures he had created continued to function, the principles he had established continued to guide behavior, and the psychological and strategic lessons of his life remained embedded in the culture of organized crime. His legacy is not only in the wealth he accumulated or the operations he controlled, but in the enduring blueprint of organization, strategy, and psychological mastery that he left behind. He transformed the underworld into a system of enduring sophistication, demonstrating that the true measure of power lies not in the momentary exercise of force but in the ability to shape human behavior, manage complexity, and leave structures that persist beyond one's own presence. Luciano's life serves as a prism through which we can understand the evolution of organized crime, the interplay of psychology and strategy, and the enduring consequences of ambition and intellect applied to a morally ambiguous world. His story is a reminder that power is fragile yet can be made resilient through foresight, structure, and perception. It is a testament to the enduring influence of a man who, despite imprisonment, exile, and constant threats, managed to leave an indelible mark on the history of organized crime, a legacy of strategy, intellect, and human understanding that continues to echo across decades and continents. Lucky Luciano's life is a study in contrasts, power and vulnerability, loyalty and betrayal, intellect and ruthlessness. The myth of the untouchable Don often overshadows the reality of a man who built, lost, and adapted his empire with unmatched strategic brilliance. His story is not merely about crime or wealth, it is about human ambition, perception, and influence. From the crowded streets of Brooklyn to the corridors of New York's power, from prison to the sunlit shores of Sicily, his journey reflects both the exhilaration of creation and the inevitability of consequence. Even as legal pressures, betrayal, and exile challenged him, Luciano maintained influence through psychological insight, reputation, and foresight. He demonstrated that true power is not just physical or territorial but also strategic and perceptual. His greatest achievement was transforming the criminal world into a disciplined, business-like system, introducing structures, codes, and the governing commission to regulate disputes and maintain order among mafia families. Violence became strategic, operations more sophisticated, and loyalty was managed with intelligence as much as fear. Exile and the final years of his life revealed a man forced into reflection, stripped of immediate authority yet capable of shaping events from a distance. He evolved from a figure defined by action into a strategist defined by insight, patience, and psychological mastery. Luciano's story is both myth and reality. The glamour of legend captivates, but the enduring lessons lie in intellect, foresight, and the ability to influence systems and people across time and space. In the end, Lucky Luciano leaves a legacy that extends far beyond crime. He exemplifies how power, when paired with strategy and human understanding, can endure despite setbacks, imprisonment, and exile. The myth may enthrall, but the reality instructs. True mastery is measured by the ability to anticipate, adapt, and leave structures and influence that outlast the man himself.